He woke up because he was cold, and being cold meant he was not dead. That was the first thing that made no sense. He had been told over and over that there would be no waking up, that if the Americans took him, the waking would be worse than the dying. And yet here he was, on his back, under a canvas roof he did not recognize, with a clean bandage wrapped tight around a wound he remembered receiving in the dark. A shape moved beside him, an American, the enemy. The man leaned down, and the Japanese soldier braced for the knife, for the boot, for whatever his officers had promised the Americans would do to him. The American held out a canteen of water. What happened to him happened thousands of times in the last year of the Pacific War, and almost never before it. A man who had been ordered to die found himself alive, fed, and bandaged by the very people he had been taught to fear more than death. It is a true story, and like most true things about that war, it is not a clean one. Because for these acts of mercy to mean anything, you have to understand the savagery they were carved out of, on both sides. So before the water, before the surrender, before the weeping men we will come to by the end of this, we have to start with the wall. The wall that every Japanese soldier carried inside his own head. In January of 1941, the Japanese War Ministry, under a man named Hideki Tojo, issued a field code called the Senjinkun. It was read aloud to soldiers. It was memorized. And one line of it settled into the marrow of an entire army. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving a stain on your honor. Understand what that sentence did. In most armies, surrender when you are out of options is a tragedy, but it is survivable. Your family gets you back. In the Japanese Army of 1941, surrender was not the end of your dignity. It was the end of your families. To be captured was to smear a permanent stain across your parents' name, your village, everyone who had ever spoken of you with pride. Death was not the punishment for failure. Death was the way out of shame. And on top of that wall, the command built another one. Propaganda. Japanese soldiers and Japanese civilians were told, plainly and repeatedly, that the Americans were not soldiers, but animals. That any man who surrendered would be tortured. That any woman who was captured would be raped. That prisoners were murdered for sport. On the island of Okinawa, this lie was so complete that it drove families to kill themselves, parents and children, rather than walk down a hill toward American lines. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing. The Japanese army had a policy for its own wounded. A wounded man was not to fall into enemy hands. So when a soldier was too badly hurt to keep fighting, his own medical officer might kill him, or hand him a grenade and expect him to use it on himself. Sit with that for a second. A wounded Japanese soldier expected exactly two endings: a bullet from his own doctor, or a grenade in his own hand. So when an American corpsman knelt down in the mud and started wrapping a bandage around his leg instead, the act did not just surprise him. It did not fit anywhere. There was no shelf in his mind to put it on. Everything he had been told about war, about the enemy, about his own worth, said this was impossible. And it was happening anyway. That collision is the story I want to tell you. But let me show you the darkness it collided with first, because if I only tell you the kind half, you should not believe me, and you would be right not to. The Pacific was not a chivalrous war. It was, in the words of the historian John Dower, a war without mercy. American troops were fed their own version of the same poison, taught to see the Japanese as vermin, as subhuman, as something less than men. And some of them acted on it. Prisoners who were trying to surrender were sometimes shot where they stood. And the dead were not always left in peace. Some American servicemen collected trophies from Japanese corpses: skulls, ears, bones, teeth. A photograph of a young woman posing with a Japanese skull her boyfriend had mailed home ran in Life magazine. A letter opener carved from a Japanese soldier's arm bone was presented as a gift to President Roosevelt. Now, most men did not do this, but most men knew it was happening, and a great many of them simply accepted it as the way of that war. And we know how widespread it was because of who tried to stop it. The Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet issued an order in September of 1942 that no part of the enemy's body was to be used as a souvenir. The Joint Chiefs of Staff issued another directive. The Army's own lawyers ruled that the practice violated the Geneva Convention and could, in theory, be punished by death. Armies do not write orders banning things that nobody is doing, so hold both of these pictures at the same time because the truth lives in the space between them. There were men in American uniforms taking teeth from the dead, and there were men in American uniforms giving water to the living enemy. Sometimes they were in the same unit. Sometimes, as you will see, they were the same kind of men on the same afternoon. The mercy in this story is not remarkable because Americans were gentle. It is remarkable because it broke cleanly and against all odds from a war that gave no one any reason to be. And it broke early, in the worst possible place, so the men who came later would have learned the fear the hard way. August 1942, Guadalcanal, a river the Americans called the Tenaru. A Japanese force of roughly 800 men threw themselves at the Marine line and was almost entirely destroyed. When it was over, of those 800, about 15 were taken alive. 15. But it was how the rest died that taught the Marines their lesson. Wounded Japanese soldiers lay on the ground, apparently helpless, and when the Americans came forward to check them, to help them, the wounded men pulled the pins on grenades and blew themselves apart, taking the rescuer with them. Think about what that does to a 19-year-old with a first aid pouch. From that day forward, every wounded enemy was a question with a lethal answer. Do you help him and risk the grenade? Or do you keep your distance and let him die? The Japanese command had turned its own suffering men into traps, and it meant that any American who chose to help a wounded Japanese soldier after that was not being naive. He knew exactly what it might cost him. He did it anyway. If this story is doing for you what these stories are supposed to do, then let me say one quick thing, because it matters to whether these men stay remembered at all. This channel exists to pull true stories like this one back out of the dark, one name at a time. If that is something you want more of, subscribing is the whole reason we can keep making them. That is all. Now, back to the caves. Because the men who finally cracked that wall of fear were not, most of them, carrying rifles. Around 6,000 Japanese Americans, the second generation known as the Nisei, served in the Pacific as linguists for the Military Intelligence Service. Many of them had families sitting in internment camps back in the United States, behind American barbed wire, while these men crawled toward Japanese caves on American orders. The Marines called them cave flushers. It is an ugly nickname for one of the bravest jobs of the war because what it actually meant was this: walking, unarmed, toward a hole in the rock full of armed and desperate men who had every reason to shoot the first face they saw, and trying to talk them out alive. Consider a Marine private named Guy Gabaldon. He was 18 years old on Saipan in July of 1944. He was from East Los Angeles, and he had been half-raised by a Japanese-American family there, which meant he spoke the language and knew the courtesies. And on the 8th of July, alone, he walked up to caves full of Japanese soldiers and civilians and made them a promise: food, water, care for their wounded. that they would not be harmed. He shared his own cigarettes. He pointed to the American ships offshore as if to say, "Look how many we are, and none of it has to end the way you were told." In a single day, around 800 people came out and gave themselves up to one teenager. Over the whole campaign, the number is estimated between 1,300 and 1,500. His Navy Cross citation would later credit him with ensuring what it called a definite, humane treatment of civilian prisoners. He did that with a promise and a pack of cigarettes. Or consider Sergeant Bob Kubo, a Nisei linguist also on Saipan, later that same month. There was a cave holding 8 armed Japanese soldiers and 122 civilian hostages. Kubo climbed down a cliff and went in with a pistol he never drew. The soldiers called him a traitor. How, they demanded, could a man of Japanese blood fight against Japan? And Kubo, sitting in the dark, surrounded by men who wanted him dead, answered them. "I am also the son of Japanese parents," he said, "but I was born in the United States. The United States is my country, and I fight for it." Then he did something stranger than any argument. He took out his own field rations and began to eat, and he offered the food to the starving men across from him. For hours they talked and shared that meal, and at the end of it the soldiers released 122 hostages and surrendered. Kubo received the Distinguished Service Cross, the highest decoration given to any Nisei in the entire Pacific War. And the thing that ended the standoff was not the pistol he carried, it was the meal he shared. Now take everything you have just learned, the wall, the fear, the promises, and bring it to Okinawa in the spring of 1945, where it all comes to a head. The Americans dropped roughly 8 million surrender leaflets over that island. 8 million pieces of paper promising the one thing the Japanese soldier had been trained not to believe, that he would be treated with decency. And for a long time, it did not work. For the first 70 days of the battle, the number of Japanese who surrendered to the American 10th Army averaged fewer than 4 men a day. The wall was holding, and then it broke. Between the 12th and the 18th of June, that number jumped from under 4 a day to more than 50 a day. Something had finally gotten through. By the time it was over, more than 7,400 Japanese had surrendered to the 10th Army, including over 200 officers and more than 3,000 unarmed laborers. Across the whole campaign, the surrenders numbered somewhere around 11,000. Admiral Nimitz announced that nearly 10,000 prisoners had been taken by late June alone. If those numbers sound small to you, they should not. This was the first battle in the entire Pacific War where Japanese soldiers surrendered in the thousands. At places like Guadalcanal, they had surrendered in the dozens. Something on Okinawa was different, and a lot of it came down to individual men who refused to let the killing be the whole story. There was a Nisei sergeant named Takejiro Higa. He and his brother Warren had actually grown up on Okinawa, and they spoke the local island dialect, not just standard Japanese. Between them, they are credited with coaxing more than 30,000 Okinawan civilians out of the caves and family tombs where they were hiding, waiting to die. 30,000 people who had been told the Americans would murder them, talked back into the light by a voice that sounded like home. And Higa left us one small moment that says everything. He offered 2 captured Japanese soldiers a ration of American food, and they would not touch it. They were certain, absolutely certain, that it was poisoned, that this was the trick, the cruelty they had been promised. So Higa took the ration back, and he ate some of it himself, in front of them, to prove that it was safe. And only then, watching an enemy eat first, did 2 starving men let themselves believe they were allowed to live. That is the whole war in a single gesture, a lie so deep that kindness had to be proven before it could be accepted. There was another one of these men, Sergeant Vic Nishijima, who had volunteered out of the Tule Lake internment camp, one of the places where his own government held people like him behind wire. On the small island of Ieshima, he talked about 150 civilians out of a single cave, saving them from the mass suicides that took so many others on that same ground. And here is what the prisoners themselves said once they were safe. We know this because a scholar named Ulrich Straus, working from their own memoirs and from interviews with the survivors decades later, wrote it all down. Based on their testimony, the men who had expected torture found instead that they were fed and clothed, and their wounds were treated. Many of them were so disarmed by this, so unprepared for mercy, that they felt they now owed their captors something. They had been ready to die rather than say a word, and instead they described the interrogation not as a torture chamber, but as the first place an enemy had ever shown them kindness. Even the Okinawan civilians said it. In the official record, you can read the plain summary of it. In view of the propaganda claiming that American policy would be rape and torture and murder, they were, in the words of the report, often surprised at the comparatively humane treatment they received. Surprised. It is such a quiet word for what it actually was. These were people who had watched neighbors take their own children's lives rather than face what was coming. And what was coming turned out to be food and medicine, and men who let them live. If you have stayed with me this far, this next part is the reason I wanted to tell this story at all. Because for Takejiro Higa, the man who ate the ration to prove it was safe, the war held one more moment. During an interrogation on Okinawa, he looked across at the prisoners in front of him and realized he knew them. They were his own former classmates, boys he had gone to school with on this same island before any of them wore a uniform. "Don't you recognize your own classmate?" he asked them. They stared at him, unable to believe it. The man who held their fate, the enemy interrogator they had been terrified of, was a boy they had sat beside as children. And in his own words, what happened next was this. "Three of us grabbed each other's shoulders, and I don't mind telling you we had a cry." Three grown men, on opposite sides of the worst war in human history, holding on to each other's shoulders and weeping. Not because anyone won, because for one moment the lie fell away and they saw each other as what they had always been, the boys who grew up together on a small island before the world told them to die apart. But I promised you this would not be a clean story, and I am going to keep that promise to the end. Because the mercy in it did not come from angels. It came from the same exhausted, frightened, sometimes brutal men who were fighting the ugliest war of their lives. There was a Marine named Eugene Sledge, who survived Peleliu and Okinawa and later wrote the finest memoir we have of that fighting. And Sledge tells a story on himself. He was reaching for the mouth of a dead Japanese soldier, about to pry out the gold teeth the way he had watched other men do, when a Navy corpsman stopped him. The corpsman told him the teeth might carry disease. But Sledge understood what was really happening. The corpsman was giving him a reason, an excuse, to not become the thing the war was trying to turn him into. And I want you to notice who it was. It was a corpsman, one of the medics. The same job, the same kind of man who knelt in the mud and wrapped bandages around wounded enemy soldiers. The mercy and the savagery did not live on two different sides of that war. They lived inside the same units, sometimes inside the same men. And it was often the medics, the ones whose entire purpose was to keep people alive, who quietly held the line on what an American was allowed to become. This is where the wounded come back into the story. Remember, it is estimated that only about a third of the Japanese who became prisoners had actually set out to surrender. The rest were captured because they were too sick or too badly wounded to stop it. Which means the typical Japanese prisoner was exactly the man from the beginning of this video. A wounded soldier who had fully expected to die on that field, waking up instead under American canvas, bandaged and breathing, holding a canteen of water that his own officers had sworn would never come. He had been told he was worth nothing if he lived. He had been told the enemy was a monster. He had been ready to end his own life to spare his family the shame. And a tired young man who had every reason to hate him chose, instead, to keep him alive. Most of these men died decades later, old, in a Japan that had rebuilt itself, and a great many of them carried for the rest of their lives a debt they could never name and never repay, to a corpsman whose name they never learned, to a teenager from Los Angeles, to a sergeant who shared his rations in a cave, to the men who decided, in the middle of a war without mercy, to show them some anyway. Those men, the ones who did the sparing, are mostly gone now too, and most of them were never thanked. Not really. The soldier they saved could not speak their language. The war moved on. The names got lost. So I want to end by trying to give a little of that thanks back, and I need your help to do it. Somewhere in your family, there may be a name. A father, a grandfather, an uncle, a great-uncle who served in the Pacific. Maybe he talked about it. Almost certainly he did not. If there is such a person in your family, leave their name in the comments below. Just their name, and where they served if you know it. Not as an epitaph, as the thank you that most of these men, on both sides of that water, went to their graves never having heard. We read every single one, and we say every one of them back.